Think. Well, hi everyone. My name is Twin. I am Community Health Resource Center's program manager. I oversee our health education program, which you are participants in right now.
Leading the lecture today are Key and Emma. Key and Emma are graduate students in the School of Social Work at Columbia University. They are here working with our licensed clinical social workers because they are on the clinical track. Key is particularly interested in pursuing private practice, and Emma is interested in radical social work. They are here to share with you a 45 minutes to 50-minute presentation today, and we'll leave some time at the end for a Q&A or discussion.
Great, thank you, Twin. I'm Key, by the way. I'm just going to share my screen really quickly. Can you all see that, hopefully, if technology works? Perfect. Okay, I see Emma giving me a thumbs up. So I'm Key. My colleague Emma and I will be talking to you a little bit today about grief and loss during the COVID-19 pandemic. And as Twin said, we're both graduate social work students who are working at CHRC, Community Health Resource Center. And so what we're going to talk about today, we'll start off with the basics. What is grief and loss? And talk about how the pandemic has really compounded the experience of grieving. And we will go into the stages of grief and loss before we dive into resiliency factors, what are some more practical coping strategies and tips there, and end with treatment options and hopefully some additional resources that we personally have found to be helpful in this topic. So we'll start out first with definitions because the terms are often used interchangeably, but they're actually a little bit different. So loss is the experience of being deprived of something or someone we truly value. And sometimes you might not even know how much you value it or the person until it is no longer available, right? Such as loss of a routine or loss of normalcy, perhaps. Grief, on the other hand, is a mental, physical, emotional, kind of psychological reaction you have to that particular loss that has already happened. And so everyone experiences grief in their own way because everyone's relationship with the one they've lost is unique. And lastly, bereavement. So bereavement is the period after a loss where the grief is actually experienced. And it can be a particularly long period of bereavement or a short one, depending on numerous other factors that we will touch upon in the rest of the presentation. So unfortunately, grief and loss is particularly relevant right now because of the unthinkable number of deaths that have happened. I read recently in an article that it's an estimated 12 million individuals that are recently bereaved. And so experts believe that for every one death, there's actually 9 people on average that are grieving. And so I'm sure you've heard of the old adage of time heals all wounds. And when it comes to grief, that's actually not entirely accurate for everyone. The majority, 60%, handle the grief kind of on their own with the support of their family and friends. So they go through the stages of grief, and with time, they start to slowly feel a bit better. An estimated 30% seek out some sort of structured additional help, whether it be kind of maybe with a mental health professional like someone at CHRC, or even with community resources like in their local church. And then a minority, an estimated 10%, qualify for what we call in the mental health field complicated grief. And so let's talk a little bit about complicated grief and what that actually is. So, like I said, the majority of people, the initial, often kind of debilitating grief starts to subside over time. But for a small majority of individuals, that initial kind of reaction to the loss, that intensity and disabling experience does not reside, does not get better over time. And so that's kind of what we call complicated grief. And you'll see some of the symptoms there up on the slide in terms of constant yearning and a preoccupation with the one who has left the individual. And the actual quote unquote formal diagnosis that a healthcare professional would make has this long name, persistent complex bereavement disorder, sometimes called prolonged grief disorder. But quite often it's actually confused and misdiagnosed as depression because it manifests really similar symptoms. So imagine really intense emotional pain, a numbness, loneliness, meaninglessness, and difficulty in general engaging with life. And so essentially the loss has so severely impacted this person's ability to function and maintain other relationships that this diagnosis is formed. And so you might read the slide and you think, okay, the diagnosis seems pretty clear. The symptoms are easy to identify, but actually in real life, it can be it's not as clear. For example, often people who have lost a loved one don't end up actually in a therapist's office. They end up in their primary care physician's office because of the physical manifestation of that pain. So you might have heard this famous psychiatrist, Bessel van der Kolk. He wrote this famous book, but he says the body keeps the score. And that's really relevant when it comes to grief. So all of these symptoms that you see on this slide, everything from fatigue or disruption in sleep patterns, maybe sleeping more, sleeping less, stomach pain, chest pain, and anxiety symptoms like headaches, panic attacks, nausea, all of these things can be manifestations of the emotional grief that's felt. So now let's talk a little bit about how COVID-19, the pandemic, has impacted the experience of grieving. How does it compound the situation? So first, the constantly changing and ambiguous social distancing rules makes it really difficult, right? I know even for myself, I'm in the field, and the various tiers in California were super hard to track. Like what do the different tiers mean? When is it open? When is it not open? What can I do? What can I not do? But it also means that people can't visit their loved ones in the hospital and that their loved ones might die more isolated than they would usually. And even if you are able to visit in a hospital, like I've heard, for 48 to 72 hours, if you're allowed to go, many have said that they aren't even sure if their sick loved ones recognize them under all the protective gear, right? You have to wear like a face shield, a mask, and a gown, and shoe coverings, and all of this stuff. And they aren't sure if their loved ones even recognize them. Additionally, COVID means that you don't have the usual social support that you normally would, and that you're not able to conduct post-death funerals and rituals in the same way. Maybe your friends and family, for example, can't fly to the funeral because of travel bans or safety precautions. And so you might feel a lot more alone in your suffering. And the internet is a wonderful thing. Like, it allows us to all connect and be on this call right now, but it really doesn't replace human contact, right? Like, it doesn't replace a hug. It doesn't replace grabbing a cup of coffee with a friend who you can talk to. And so additionally, on top of all that, there's a shortage of community resources, right? Places being closed, or even if they are opened, a wait list, a general backlog of services in general. And then the last bullet point, which is also important, is that the consequences surrounding the actual death of COVID is actually really complicated. COVID as a virus can be extremely sudden in its kind of health deterioration. And so people can get worse without warning. I'm sure if there's any healthcare professionals on the call, they can attest to this, but the death is often more unexpected and difficult. And so all of these factors on this slide and more increase the risk for someone to get diagnosed with complicated grief. And honestly, perhaps what makes the situation worse is that most people aren't just going through one type of loss. They're going through multiple losses of multiple forms and variations. And there's just a few on this slide. Loss of a job, right? Loss of financial security, loss of psychological safety during this time, loss of normalcy and routine, and honestly, so often loss of hope for the future. Like, sometimes you can't even remember what it was like before all of this happened. And we've talked about social supports and services already, and I'm sure that you can actually think of a lot more types of secondary losses that maybe you personally have experienced during this time. So while grief is unique to everyone, there are generally 5 main stages of grief that people roughly experience. Stages is kind of a misnomer, actually, because they're not nice and neat, and they're not linear or one directional. So I've heard someone talk about them as waves that come and go, and I think that's a bit more accurate. But nevertheless, this was developed by a woman, a Swiss-American psychiatrist named Elizabeth Kubler-Ross in 1969. And keep in mind that this is not a map through grief. It's merely just a tool to help us frame and identify with what we may be feeling through an incredibly messy and tough journey. So we'll start up at the top there. And the first stage of grief is shock and denial. Contrary to what we might think, this actually helps us survive the loss. In this stage, the world is meaningless and it's overwhelming. Life makes no sense. And oftentimes we feel quite numb. And despite the intense pain we feel in this stage, grief and loss in this phase, so manifested through denial and shock, actually is a way of coping in some ways and makes survival possible, right? Denial in this way actually helps us to pace the grief a little bit. And then there in gray, anger, right? Why is this happening to me? Who can I blame? And maybe the anger is turned inwards. Maybe it's turned towards yourself. Like, what could I have done differently? And anger in this phase can actually be an anchor sometimes, whereas previously we maybe felt nothing or just shock. The anger gives our feelings a type of structure and force in this phase. And then third, depression and a detachment. Our nervous system shuts down. It's too much. We can't get out of bed. We don't want to speak to anyone potentially. And there's this kind of overwhelming helplessness and emptiness that people experience. The fourth stage is the bargaining stage. So there's a struggle here to find meaning and a desire to tell your story. You're kind of ruminating on what happened. And so there's actually a lot of, if only I did X, Y, and Z, maybe things would be different in this phase. And then the last phase on the left there, you'll see acceptance. Acceptance of new roles, acceptance of new options, and acceptance of essentially a new reality. And so it might look nice and neat in this little chart here, but here's what a client actually experiencing grief and loss drew of how it actually feels. It's messy, right? It's all over the place. You feel everything and you feel nothing. And you want to, it's all of these emotions. It's 4 steps forward and 3 steps back. And what you don't actually see in this maze is that there is an exit, that someday the grief gets a little bit lighter, but it feels like this. But someday it can get lighter because humans are incredibly resilient. Have you ever come across someone actually who has faced tremendous trauma and are able to maintain their well-being in the face of that adversity? That person is really resilient. And so this comes into play when we're experiencing grief as well. It's kind of a protective factor in the face of tremendous loss. So this slide is a particular study that shows a pattern of behaviors, a set of factors that are predictive of increased resiliency. If you're like me, I look at the slide and I'm like, okay, what if I don't have any of these factors? Does that mean I'm not resilient? And that's not true. It just means that in this particular study, these are increased factors of greater resilience. And so the first is having a really strong sense of self. How is it that you view yourself? Do you see yourself as someone who can usually tackle problems, someone who can overcome odds, maybe are usually pretty positive in your disposition? That's really important when it comes to resiliency. The second factor is a sense of agency. And what agency means in this particular context is autonomy, having a sense of control. And in this research, they found that even if you had control over just a tiny bit of your day, even if it was just your morning routine, for example, it was actually correlated with less stress in this case. And then regular physical activity was also extremely important. 10 minutes of walking, for example, was correlated with decreased stress and decreased depression symptoms as well. And then the researchers found what they termed this fancy phase called adaptive meaning making. And that's just a way of saying it's a behavior where someone is able to turn a really negative, stressful event and reconstrue it as beneficial in some way. So taking something potentially negative like COVID-19, the pandemic, and seeing it as, is there any way that you could see it as a potential or an opportunity for growth and for change? And then lastly, and unsurprisingly, and it's not just in this study, but study after study, it shows social support makes a huge difference with resiliency, and that we can't operate on an island. We need other people to help us through this. And so what does it look like to cope with grief and loss? It starts with internalizing the loss, allowing yourself to truly grieve. And honestly, perhaps that's the hardest part of this type of work, is that the only way out of it is through it. You really need to experience the full loss of what you are feeling. And that's really important, recognizing and honoring the memories that you have with the person and allowing yourself to slowly adjust to life in this new reality. And finding meaning in the loss is also incredibly important, which is something that therapy can often help with. And Emma's going to speak more to that in a bit. But finding meaning doesn't mean that the grieving process is over or that we are okay with the loss. It just means in some small way, we are able to make sense maybe of the unfathomable. And so slowly, hopefully over time, the bereaved individual starts to recognize that there is hope on the other side of this pain and that there is a reason to move forward again. So yesterday, Emma and I were chatting, kind of going through the slides, and we realized there's probably some folks in the audience who maybe aren't personally dealing with grief and loss due to COVID, but are actually supporting a friend or family member, right? Have you ever thought this, where you're like, I don't know if I'm saying the right things. I don't know if this is helpful at all. And so we wanted to show you this video, this animated video that we found that helps us understand how to support a grieving friend. I'm going to play the video.
So what do we do about all the pain we see in the world? All the pain we feel in our own lives? And why does it seem like our best efforts to help somebody feel better always backfire? I've been studying intense grief and loss, baby death, violent crimes, accidents, suicides, and natural disasters. And I've learned something really interesting. Cheering people up, telling them to be strong and persevere, helping them move on, it doesn't actually work. It's kind of a puzzle. It seems counterintuitive, but the way to help someone feel better is to let them be in pain. This is true for those giant losses and the ordinary, everyday ones. Educator Parker Palmer writes, "The human soul doesn't want to be advised or fixed or saved. It simply wants to be witnessed, exactly as it is." He's talking about acknowledgement here. Acknowledgement is this really amazing multi-tool. It makes things better even when they can't be made right. For example, somebody's struggling. Their baby died, or there's been a bad accident, or their mom got sick, and they're just sad. It's way more helpful to join them in their pain than it is to cheer them up, but here's what we tend to do instead. You have 2 other children, you need to find joy in them. Or, you know what you need? You just need to go out dancing and shake it off. Or, I felt really sad once. Did you try acupuncture? We're not really sure what to do with someone's pain, so we do what we've been taught. We look on the bright side. We try to make people feel better. We give them advice. It's not like this is nefarious. We try to cheer people up because we think that's our job. We're not supposed to let people stay sad. The problem is, you can't heal somebody's pain by trying to take it away from them. Now, acknowledgement does something different. When a giant hole opens up in someone's life, it's actually much more supportive to acknowledge that hole and let pain exist. It's actually a radical act to let things hurt. It goes against what we've been taught. In order to really support you, I have to acknowledge that things really are as bad as they feel to you. If I try to cheer you up, you end up defending yourself and your feelings. If I give you advice, you feel misunderstood instead of supported. And I don't get what I want either, because I wanted you to feel better. It's pretty rare that you could actually talk somebody out of their pain. Rarely does the admonishment to look on the bright side actually heal things for someone. It just makes them stop telling you about their pain. It's so tempting to try to make things better. When somebody shares something painful, it's much more helpful to say, "I'm sorry that's happening. Do you want to tell me about it?" To be able to say, "This hurts," without being talked out of it, that's what helps. Being heard helps. It seems too simple to be of use, but acknowledgement can be the best medicine we have. It makes things better, even when they can't be made right.
Okay, I hope you got something out of that short video, even if it's just a nugget. I know I've been talking a lot, so I'm going to hand it over to my colleague Emma, who's going to talk to us a little bit about more practical tips that we can do to further our grief recovery. I'm going to let her share her screen. Perfect.
Okay, so I'm Emma. Thank you so much for joining us. I hope you enjoyed that little video. I find it really, really meaningful and beautiful. So I'm glad that we were able to share it with you all. I'm going to be taking us through the next portion of the presentation. So on this slide, we have a diagram that illustrates a really powerful model in grief counseling called the dual process model. Basically, the theory is that the bereaved individual needs to, in order to heal, oscillate or move between these two circles that you see. On the left, you have moments and activities that really confront the grief squarely, where the grief feels really intense. These may include activities like going through old photos or watching family videos. And on the right side of the diagram, you have what's called restoration-oriented activities. This is essentially a fancy way of saying to face the future. This may mean regaining confidence to try new things or even forming new relationships. So of course, we want to share some additional tips that may help folks who are bereaved in navigating grief and that really facilitate coping. So first, share your feelings. Actively sharing our emotions is crucial in the healing and coping process. Don't be afraid to ask for help. Storytelling and reminiscing. When people tell stories, they create links between the world, themselves, and others. Stories can be used to reconnect families who experience loss and may play an important role in family meaning making during bereavement. Religious and spiritual rituals. Faith facilitates the acceptance of death as part of a plan. Religious beliefs can provide a sense that there is someone to help individuals cope with their suffering, as well as to support them in facing the difficult tasks ahead. Funeral traditions may also play an important role in managing and honoring community grief and loss by honoring the life of the deceased and offering comfort to grieving family members. Keep a journal. Writing your feelings and thoughts in a journal can help to not only process your grief, but may also provide an opportunity to track your progress through the healing process. Get creative. You may be able to express and process overwhelming emotions through art and playing music. Exercise regularly. Do things like going on a quiet walk or a run to calm your body and release energy. Meditate. Meditation, sorry about that. Uh-oh. What's happening? Why won't it go back? Uh-oh. Sorry, everyone. I just got completely kicked out of the presentation.
No worries, it happens.
Okay. I don't know if this is my internet twin or...
Don't think that it might be a Zoom issue.
Okay, here we go. Meditate. Meditation practices can be helpful in managing both stress and grief. Avoid making big changes. A major loss can cause upheaval in your life. hold off on changing jobs, moving, or making other big life decisions to keep things feeling stable. Set aside time to grieve. Scheduling grief might seem unusual, but adding designated time to your daily calendar can provide a sense of permission to display and process intense feelings. Find a space where you feel free to let yourself grieve without judgment. And finally, join a grief support group. Being around others who have also recently experienced major loss can help you share the burden of grief. So here's a quote that Key and I thought was really meaningful and salient from Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who she mentioned earlier. The quote reads, "The reality is that you will grieve forever. You will not get over the loss of a loved one. You will learn to live with it. You will heal and you will rebuild yourself around the loss you have suffered. You will be whole again, but you will never be the same. Nor should you be the same, nor would you want to." And remember, your grieving process is absolutely unique. Different social identities, including gender, race, and ethnicity, are related to grief reactions and intersect at various levels of experience. Grief develops differently for everyone, so there isn't one correct or proper way to grieve. Further, different systems in which individuals are embedded may influence their grief reactions. So from an ecological perspective, which is what we're seeing in this image here, in our microsystems or at the individual level, which is this inner circle in the middle there, interpersonal relationships, such as those with family members or close friends, may play an important role in the way a person processes grief. A person's exosystem, which is this next ring, includes legislation and policies that may impact grief reactions. For example, policies regarding paid leave or absence following the death of a loved one may require grieving individuals to suppress their grief, thereby negatively influencing grief reactions. Within the macro systems, which is this outer ring, the media and Western values have an impactful influence as at this level, death is increasingly hidden, avoided, or even unwelcome. The avoidance of emotional processing regarding grief may increase the risk of prolonged grief disorder or complicated grief. So we want to take a minute to acknowledge ways that you can be creative and still have a funeral in the pandemic, because as we mentioned, these rituals can be really important to the coping process. So unfortunately, with the current social distancing requirements and travel restrictions still in place, the inability to gather after the loss of a loved one may be difficult for families and further intensify feelings of loss. So here are some suggestions to help people connect from a distance. You can plan to gather at a later date once it's safe to do so. Just because you can't have a traditional funeral or wake or shiva right away doesn't mean you can't plan one for a later date and do it right. Live stream funerals and direct burials using tools such as Facebook or Instagram Live. This can be a great way for people to kind of tune in real time and still be able to participate in something like a funeral. Also, Facebook tends to be a really friendly platform if there are folks in the older demographic as part of the inner social circle. Friends and family may also be able to witness the funeral safely from their cars. And lastly, encourage family and friends to write notes, send photos, and create art. These are things that can be buried with the individual who's passed away or cremated with them that can really provide an important way to connect with the person who's passed away. So as Key mentioned, I'm also going to be talking a bit about grief counseling and bereavement therapy. In some cases, managing our grief on our own just really isn't enough. In general, grief tends to change over time, as we've mentioned several times. So grief counseling or professional bereavement therapy might be useful if you need help working through your grief. Here are some signs that therapy might be right for you. If you're experiencing sleep disturbances or a loss of appetite, if you're having feelings of worthlessness or helplessness, if you find that you're neglecting your personal care, if you're feeling unable to return to work after a long period of time, or if you're experiencing suicidal thoughts. So there are tons of treatment options out there. And we really want to highlight that it's super important to find a therapist or a style of therapy that best suits your personal needs. So these are just a couple suggestions. This list is not exhaustive by any means. First, there's something called time-limited therapy. This is in this specific grief work, it's designed to last no longer than 12 sessions, which makes it very intentional. The clinician and the participant are able to come up with an agenda of sorts of things that they want to focus on and really dive headfirst into the grief. Psychodrama-based techniques. This is an action-based process in which the therapist or a member of a therapy group may act as the deceased individual or object. So this is an opportunity to do a role play of sorts where someone can act as the deceased individual and give the participant or the bereaved individual an opportunity to say things that maybe they didn't have a chance to say, or express feelings that they didn't have a chance to express, which may provide a sense of closure. Gestalt therapy and the empty chair technique. This approach to psychotherapy aims to enable clients to become free from blocks and unfinished business that may reduce satisfaction, fulfillment, and growth. Some clinicians use something that's called an empty chair technique. So similar to psychodrama, it's a role play of sorts where the bereaved individual will face an empty chair and engage in that same kind of process of sharing things that maybe they didn't have a chance to before the person died. And finally, group therapy can be really helpful. Group processing around grief provides an opportunity for social support from other bereaved individuals who can relate to the experience of loss. In group therapy, folks are also given an opportunity to learn about the process of grief and how it's often not linear and it's very different for everyone. So that can be really validating and helpful. So we also want to take a moment to recognize that the COVID-19 pandemic has been very impactful on our medical professionals as well. One of the greatest challenges for medical professionals during the COVID-19 pandemic has been the need to witness the suffering and death of their patients. This trauma is unique because while engaging in their own process, providers are expected to tend to the emotions of families who've just experienced a major loss as well. In many ways, death is equated with failure and may be a source of moral injury and distress for medical professionals. So here are some suggestions for things that we think are important for these people who are working on the front lines. They need adequate breaks, absolutely, while they're working. If they can be provided free food while they're working so that they can nourish their bodies, that can be really helpful as well. Rotating hours and time off, transparent communication with the members of their team, coordination of hotel rooms and donated housing for people who can't go home due to COVID-19 safety precautions, and community support campaigns. So they know that their community is behind them and really supporting their efforts. That can be a huge help as well. So the next two slides include resources that Key and I think could be really helpful if you are bereaved or if you've recently lost someone. And this is a really wide range of resources. Twin is also going to send this out as an email following the presentation. But this is everything from, websites that offer tips for how to remember someone who's passed away or in planning for end of life or funeral planning. There are some meditations, some books, and then some text lines as well, which can be super helpful for fast in the moment support if you need it. You can text someone anonymously, and on the other end of that text, they can offer you some support. And that's the end of our presentation. So thank you all for coming, and we'd love to open it up for any questions.
Thanks so much. Emma, and thanks to you, Key, for starting our presentation. I just stopped screen so we can all be on gallery view. Janice, so nice to see you with us. For anyone who came in a little bit after my introduction, Janice is one of CHRC's licensed clinical social workers. And right now we are in the Q&A or discussion portion of our presentation. And we had some here in the chat box that Emma and Key have already started answering, but for those of us who are dialing in and can't exactly see the chat box, I'll go ahead and read the question. And Emma and Key, if I could get your help to just reiterate your answers that you wrote down, that'd be really helpful. So someone mentioned here, at what point would prolonged grief turn into simple depression? Would the approach to treatment differ a lot? Emma, I believe you already started on answering this one, so I'll leave this to you.
Yeah, so thank you for the question. So typically, individuals are not diagnosed with clinical depression if they have been bereaved within the last 6 months. That's one of the criteria to kind of rule out a depression diagnosis, and it's an important one. After those 6 months, a mental health professional can kind of assess what's going on and make a distinction. However, these things can also be really complicated and hard to diagnose. It depends very much on the individual and what's going on. So it will be up to the mental health professional to assess that. And then some treatments might be similar in their approach, but I think one thing that's important to note is that clinical depression is often treated with medical or psychotropic interventions, whereas grief typically wouldn't be, so medications specifically.
Thanks so much for that. Key or Janice, do either of you have anything to add to that answer or this discussion?
Yeah, so I do want to say, generally when somebody experiences a traumatic event that, results in grief, if anything is prolonged beyond 6 months, we may, as clinicians, consider a post-traumatic stress disorder diagnosis. It doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to alter the course of treatment per se, but some of the treatments may entail some trauma-indicated type of interventions. So that's something that we can assess as we kind of go along with treatment.
Thank you, Janice. Moving on to this next thing, someone added to the discussion saying, I've not lost someone, but there are people I fear losing, and the fear of losing them is too tremendous. I don't know how to prepare for the shock of actually losing them. Is it possible to prepare yourself emotionally? And Key, you already started answering this one. If you'd like, you can get started.
Yeah, this is an important question, I think, and one that I think about quite often. And to a certain degree, it's actually impossible to really prepare yourself for the loss of someone you truly love. And you'll probably, no matter what type of prep you do, feel those overwhelming emotions. But it is potentially possible to plan ahead for the difficult time, as in regards to kind of practical things that you can get in order to ensure that the period is that you're ready a little bit more for the grief, and then kind of just sorting through also your own emotional reaction to why you might be feeling such an intense fear or whatever emotional reaction it is, which therapy can actually help with. It just kind of depends on how kind of debilitating that fear is and whether or not you want to seek out additional help for it. Janice, are you speaking? I can see you.
Sorry, that wasn't meant for you.
Awesome. But yeah, I think that's an important question. So thank you, Kelly, for asking it.
Janice, did you want to add to that also?
Yeah, I was just going to say, Key hit it right on the head that, there is really no way for us to prepare for the loss of someone that we're going to love. being gone. But, I think it is helpful to kind of recognize, how can we make that person as most comfortable as possible if you are involved in their care, because that does provide a sense of comfort when they are gone, that you were able to spend that time with them and give them the dignity that they needed. I think it's also really helpful just to prepare maybe who your supports are going to be and who you might be able to lean on, because in the moment of grief, you're not necessarily going to be able to think rationally or linearly. So it is helpful to kind of identify those persons early on, and then appoint those persons to provide that support as needed.
Thanks, Denise. I believe there is one more question in here that asks specifically about bereavement therapy and its coverage for health insurance. I'm not sure about that, but if you have specifics, be helpful.
I just put in the chat that it does depend on your health insurance, but Janice actually just shared this with me a little while ago, that a lot of hospices offer bereavement support outside of kind of like formal individual therapy that that people might qualify for. So it's always good to kind of ask. And then there's also some free, in the Bay Area at least, free grief support groups that certain organizations offer, and we can send those out in the resources afterwards.
Thanks so much. Yes, and to just echo that, resources, including the video that you watched earlier regarding how to help someone cope with grief, that will also be included. It's actually in the chat box right now, but I'll definitely include it in the email I'll be sending out later. Yeah, I think that was our last question in the chat, but at this point, I encourage anyone to unmute themselves and ask questions if they want, or add anything to the discussion, or Emma, Key, Janice, if anything that you'd like to leave our audience with on this Friday afternoon. The floor is all yours.
Well, if there's no other questions, I would just like to say again, thank you to everyone for joining us. It was wonderful to be able to do this. And I think this topic and this information is really important, especially given what we've all been through over the last year. So I hope it was useful.
And feel free to email as well if anything comes up. You have a question for us. Our email is at the end of the presentation that Twin will send out, and we will follow up via mail.
Yes, and one last thing that I am sending along into the chat box, if you have access to it, it's a link to a form, and it won't even take 5 minutes, but it would be really appreciated if you could complete that for us. I'll include it into the post-event email, but if there isn't anything else that anyone would like to add or ask, I'll be happy to end the presentation early. This was recorded, and the recording will be ready and uploaded onto our resources library online within 2 business days. You'll get the link to where the video will be located, so you can feel free to check that within 2 business days. I usually try to get it on there a little bit earlier. Thanks so much. And the email you get, you can feel free to reply to if you have any additional resources you're looking for. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Key. Thank you, Emma. And thanks for joining us, Janice. It was really great having you.